Welcome to Arise, the Honest Man's podcast, with myself, Karun Avatar, Jai Jagannath, Dave Madhava, and Hari Vilas. What is this about? Real men arising to end the silence around us about the chains that bind us, to dispel the darkness of illusion with luminous spiritual technologies, to finally become the hero within us all. And I just want to say that we were just informed by a very benevolent and well-wishing grammar Nazi that the use of the word the use of the word arising isn't actually completely correct. But then Jai Jagannath just made like an executive decision that it's actually a poetic use of the word. So we decided to stick with it. So just for all of you like well-wishing grammar Nazis out there, we're just letting you know that this is a conscious decision.
All right. Yeah. Nice. We have a really nice topic. To be honest with you, I didn't really know how to structure my questions around it. And I didn't really even know how to think about it. So I'm very interested to see how this discussion is going to unfold. But the topic is rediscovering manhood, and what was the rest of it? And the
in the age of gender fluidity.
Okay, the reason I can't remember is because my original title was Rediscovering Manhood and the Gender Emporium, but that comes off as a little bit what was the word used?
Too poetic.
No.
Yo, what was David when you use David, when you used that particular word, I actually had to look it up. I'd never heard it before. What did you say again?
It's incendiary. I think when I heard it, right, there's people who don't struggle with that want to struggle with that, and so they create some struggle for themselves. And there's a lot of that going around. But then there are people who actually struggle with that. It's a real like issue for them. And
Sure.
So to not like relativize or dismiss that struggle that's genuine, I thought better to go with a little more neutral word than just like everybody gets to shop and it's such a choice for everyone.
Yeah, I guess when I wasn't thinking of transgenderism specifically when I used the word gender emporium. I was thinking more of there's this whole like there are 93 genders, or there's like maybe not 93, but it's like a huge number.
Yeah, no, I remember.
And so I was thinking of that, and like it has like outside of the realm of a person's mind, you can't know or recognize what that gender is, like demi-queer, or they have all these terms for them now. So when I thought the word gender emporium, I was kind of thinking of that and not thinking specifically of transgenderism, which we might somehow touch on today also. But let's get into it. I do have a first question. I thought I'll kick it off like I like to kick it off with a philosophical question of sorts to lean into the subject matter before we get into a more subjective, let's say, understanding of it. But my first question here is this. What is man? And when I say that, what is man as a category and not just a description of man in terms of the qualities that men are expected to imbibe? Let me unpack that a little bit more. I think generally when people try to describe what it is to be a man, they usually think of it in terms of different male archetypes. Like a man is a warrior, or a man is a, Brahmin archetype, for example, or warrior archetype, or artist archetype, or a man might be toxic, or a man might be nourished. Like toxic masculinity is a very popular subject matter in the social political landscape. But if you have to understand a toxic man, you have to know what is man, and you have to know what is toxic. Otherwise, the word toxic man doesn't make any sense. Like if I had no context of what the word man meant, if I heard the word toxic man, then I couldn't understand what you were talking about. So in order to even talk about something like toxic masculinity, for example, you would have to have a very clear understanding of what man is first. And it seems to me in the sort of postmodern era that we seem to be, we're a part of, man itself seems to be very much deconstructed. And so even like now when I hear people talking about toxic masculinity, I'm like, what exactly are you even talking about? Because the word man itself has been deconstructed on a social level. It appears, at least to me, that is the case, that I don't even know what you're really talking about. So I thought that would be an interesting place to start. Like, what is man as a category? before we get into talking about the different types of men that exist within that category, like, you know, in terms of race or sexuality or in terms of attributes, what is man as a category? And I guess, I mean, if you can speak on it in terms of whatever you understand from scripture, but I'm also, it's a subjective question also, like, how do you understand man as a category, and how does that impact you subjectively as an individual? That's my first question. I think it's a good one. I'm actually very proud of that question because that was the only one I could really come up with.
Yeah, it just what's immediately coming up for me is just that I don't think I've ever actually consciously thought about what it is that objectively defines man as a category, when and not immediately start thinking about what are the qualities of man. So it's a very challenging question, and today I just want to say that I particularly want to pick David Madhava and Hari Vilas's brains on this subject matter. So if any of you guys have something that comes up immediately, please do share with us.
Well, David Madhava has been a man much longer than I am.
Are you calling me old, Prabhu? I don't know.
Experienced.
Yeah, it's funny. In asking myself this question, I'm glad you asked it, Jai, but like all week since you guys have invited me into the conversation, I've been asking myself this. And like, I don't know. You know, like we have these like man up. What does that, okay. What is it? It's a sense of responsibility. And when I ask myself, you know, there's this Led Zeppelin song, in the days of my youth, I was told what it means to be a man. And now I've reached that age. I try to do all these things the best I can. But no matter how I try, I find myself to the same old jam, this Led Zeppelin song. So there are these archetypes of being a man as being able to provide, to take care, to protect, kind of an emblem of strength and responsibility. But that gets played out in modern society as just exploiting until you get caught, then being shamed when you do, and not having any real framework to execute those kind of expectations other than to exploit, to lord it over, to abuse, to like unduly exert power and influence. And so most men, including myself, up until I would say recently, where I've in the last 2 years kind of had a healthier shift, most men, I think inside feel very embarrassed about what they have to do to look like a man.
Mm. Could you perhaps elaborate slightly on why would the feeling of embarrassment come up in engaging in particular things that would make one more definitively a man, since manly things tend to generally, kind of typically be courageous and brave and out there and determined. So where would that embarrassment arise?
I like to pause before we get into that. That's a very good question. I wrote it down too, actually, incidentally. But this is why I asked my question, because when we use words like courageous, strong, provider, even, these are words that can just as easily be used in relationship to women. And especially in the postmodern era, these words are definitely thought of in relationship to women. They're not uniquely man qualities. And therefore, if you try to describe man only in terms of these qualities, you're definitely going to get, at best, an impasse between like, well, why is that uniquely male? Like, there are strong women, there are courageous women. So why are you trying to esteem those as specifically male qualities? And that's why I wanted to make the distinction between understanding man as a category, distinct from just qualifying him with the various qualities. Otherwise, you get into this impasse. Like courage and strength, etc. These are qualities, and anyone can actually have those qualities. And they may manifest uniquely in men versus with women, for example, but their qualities distinct from them. So what is man? That's why I'm really trying to zoom in on that. I don't know if I'm coming out clearly here. And maybe the answer is like Dave Madhava said, I don't really know, because I was basically coming to that conclusion too. But I wanted to make it clear that there is a distinction there. Otherwise, you're going to get into this conflict when you're like, well, a man is one who is, he's courageous in the face of ... Well, any woman can do that too. So that doesn't seem like a very satisfying sort of answer. All right. Hari Vilas, you got something on this.
Okay. I think that...
Does it make sense what I'm saying? I'm not trying to...
No, it makes sense. It makes sense.
Okay.
I mean, I think it's definitely clear that we're living in a postmodern world because we have to ask this question. I think the first thing to understand when we start speaking about masculinity or femininity is that ultimately it does have a... we get lost because the complexities arise in our social organization. Nowadays, the social aspect of being a man or a woman that is completely unclear, and therefore it's very confusing. But we have to understand that the role of masculinity is to a certain extent assigned by a culture. It's a fact. Different men have different responsibilities in different eras and different times, and as times are changing, the sort of specific form that masculinity takes also change. But I think it's very important to start with a very simple definition, is that when two people have sex, then one gets pregnant and the other one doesn't. And the one that doesn't get pregnant is the man. So you have to start with that basis, because it is really an organic basis, because the rest of the social things that come, the rest of the social attributes and responsibilities and characteristics and qualities that have to be developed are designed keeping in mind that basic organic fact. It's like if they ask Prabhupada, why is a woman not a man? Prabhupada says, because if you have sex, you get pregnant, and the other one doesn't. And it's like that has massive, massive ramifications on your social duties, how society is supposed to... It's like, so let's start with something very basic and to see, what does that mean? It means two people have sex, one gets pregnant, the other one doesn't. Okay, now who's going to do what? And, how are we going to work with that? Because that is going to, even in the average person's life, that's going to occupy at least like 50 to 60 to 70% of your life is going to deal with the reality of sex and children. So, I mean, that really is quite important. And then we can say, okay, how to deal with it, that's another question. But that's one simple way to start off with.
I love that answer. That was the answer the only answer I actually could come to. I wouldn't have expressed it the way that you did in terms of the pregnancy, which is a really good twist to me. One that I can appreciate. I don't know if that's toxic or not, but I do appreciate that. What I got from my own meditation on it is that fundamentally the idea of man and woman was tied to the gross physical body. Whereas when we think about the subject matter of man and womanhood today in the postmodern era, it's tied largely to the subtle body. And as you say, that's the subtle body is like such an interesting body because it can really be broken down and reconstructed in all sorts of fascinating ways, even while you're within the gross physical body. So it seems like the term man and woman on the most basic level, especially when you're like dealing with like sacred texts and so on, had its link to the gross physical body more than to the subtle body, which is how we normally tend to think about it today. And so if you were a man, it's because you had the male gross body. And if you were a woman, it's because you had the woman gross body. And then, of course, as you were mentioning with sex life, then one gets pregnant, the other doesn't. And that's going to have a lot of ramifications on how you organize your society. But on a most fundamental level, it actually relates to the gross physical body itself. Yeah. And it seems like, okay, you have something on that. I don't want to.
Yeah, just no, it's exactly because, and we have to understand even then many of the subtle characteristics one could say, because you see there is no real distinction between gross and subtle. It's like the two things fit like a glove into a hand.
Right.
So we know for a fact, even by modern scientific understanding, that how much of your temperament and your character traits are mediated by your hormonal discharges in your body. So the gross distinction between the masculine body and the feminine body has massive consequences. Also, for the subtle characteristics, the quality trait is a fact. Like men are statistically, it's very clear, statistically much more aggressive and assertive than the average woman, and women are statistically much more agreeable than the average man. Obviously, there's always exceptions, right. But in the postmodern world, we worship the exception. In one sense, in the social sciences, we worship the exception, but then in every single of the hard sciences, everything is run by statistics, because we see that statistics work if you want to organize a bigger whole. So yeah, it's a very nice point. The gross what's the traditional distinction, and it does really make sense, because it has also an influence on the subtle, and you cannot really separate the subtle body, the subtle personality from the gross body. The two things are going to have an effect on one another.
Why?
Let's take the time to define postmodern, just because I think it's going to come out a lot in the conversation.
Yeah, please. I actually, to be honest with you, I don't even really know what that means. I mean, I've looked it up a few times on Google, like a responsible millennial, but yeah, I would
also. And I'll just, you guys, probably many of our viewers also have seen the Campbell soup can being turned into artwork. And this idea that just a few weeks ago, I saw that some guy took a pair of sunglasses and put it in the corner of a museum.
I saw that.
And there was and just put a little barricade around it. And there was tons of people coming over and taking pictures and selfies with the sunglasses on the floor. So this kind of relativization, there's no truth in what is art, what is man, what is woman, what is right, what is wrong. It's just kind of whatever my own experience dictates as being satisfying. That's what is the truth. That's kind of the circumstance of postmodernism that we find ourselves in.
Yeah, just as a
personal.
Sorry, I just wanted to say, just for those people out there who are like really geeks and like really into this sort of stuff, that was probably an oversimplification for you. But I think that's the general idea, like the general sense that I get, that I've gotten from the few times that I've Googled postmodernism and read articles and Wikipedia and all of that. Yeah. There's a strong element of deconstruction of like social norms, of the sense of what is, like, you're giving an example of art or music. There's a deconstruction of that, and that it's really relative to individuals or the subjective world, and there's no objective sort of reality around it. So that's probably, again, an oversimplification, but that's more or less what we're going to be working with here on this episode. So forgive us our offenses, if any, but that's kind of the sense that it looks like we have. All right, Karuna, sorry to cut you off. You were about to jump in.
No. I just wanted to add super briefly that I've always liked to define postmodernism as just like a complete overemphasis of personal subjectivity to the extent where, objective truth. So I just wanted to kind of add that little tail onto what Davis said.
Just the easiest
yes,
way
and then also. Sorry, Harry.
The simplest way to understand the idea of postmodern is this also is. It's a label that is used for schools of philosophy or even in music or whatever, but it's easiest understood as a historical definition of a historical period. So the Western world had its Christian era in which the church dogma determined what is truth, and then you entered into the modern era around the 1600s, wherein rationality was then defined as the measure for truth, but then the experiment to get certainty purely on the basis of reason has failed. And then we entered into the postmodern era where people have abandoned the search for certainty and objective truth. And now that's exactly, so everything has become, as you said, more, the objectivity has become abandoned as a value because we can't reach it. We're not into dogma or revealed truth. We see that rationality also can't actually give us any specific certainty. So therefore, we search for alternative means to searching for alternative to certainty, which means much more subjectivity and playing around with all kinds of concepts that come up for question, because it cannot be grounded. Even gender cannot be grounded in anything. So therefore, we just open it up for all kind of differentiation. So that's more simply what it really means.
Nice, thank you. So just coming back to this idea, then, that I think what we're working with now so far is that man means you got the male body, gross physical body, largely, and the subtle body is necessarily connected to that body, and it kind of configures itself according to the body. I mean, we're not going to get overly philosophical here because we're not trying to put people to sleep. But when you think about like Sankhya metaphysics, for example, the ego element of nature was responsible for identity, which is what we're talking about here. The ego element has the ability to contract and expand in all sorts of interesting and funny ways. And so when the soul inside that ego element gets the body of, let's say, an ant, then the ego element contracts to fit within the confines of the ant body. And when it gets a bigger body, say like the body of a mammal or a human being, then the ego element expands to fit the confines of that new body. So there's definitely a relationship between the ego element of identity and the gross physical body that you get. And so I guess this is maybe the next question, coming from a basic understanding. I don't know if there are any comments yet here for this, but coming from the basic understanding that man means the gross physical body, then how does the ego element or man as identity relate to that point? That's kind of my second question. I don't have my questions prepared today, so it's a little bit free flowing, but I think I'm liking with the direction overall. Was my question not clear? Should I?
Not exactly. Just maybe rephrase it for a moment.
Yeah, well, man means you got the male body. That's what it means. That's where we're at. That's where we're at so far in this conversation. But the ego element necessarily expands or contracts according to the gross physical body that it gets. And so now when you're talking about man, you have to also talk about the ego element. Like, what does it mean to be man as an ego identity versus just the gross physical body, which is where we left off. And maybe in this regard, I don't know if you guys are like proper devotees, so you probably don't keep up with this stuff, but recently one actress, now actor, named, okay, I don't know how to say it even, but his name is Elliot Page.
Yeah. Previously,
he was Ellen Page. And she previously was a very, well, I don't know if she was a popular actress, but I know I've seen some of the roles that
everyone's seen her.
Her role is always the same in every movie. That's my opinion.
Was that the one that was in Juno? Was that Juno?
Yeah, Juno, one in Juno.
Oh no.
Don't say it like that. Be careful, bro. That's toxic. That's toxic masculinity. Listen, so anyway, I'm not making fun of this whatsoever. Like, I have transgender friends. I lived in the ashram with a transgender male for over a year, and none of us knew that he was transgender. He was just one of the boys, just like the rest of us, which means, again, we thought of him as man because he had the male body as far as we understood. And he certainly had the male identity that caused him to do the transition. That's what transgender means, transitioning kind of from one gender to another. So although technically speaking, biologically speaking, my friend I'm talking about now had the female body, he had the male ego or identity as far as he would relate it to the world. And that caused him to actually transition on a physical level so that he would appear as a man. And he did. And we accept him as a man. He was just one of the bros. We lived with him. He's one of the bros. Great friend. Even to this day, we're good friends. So Ellen Page is another example of this. Elliot Page now, I don't misgender anything, but he came out as Elliot Page, and it's been a journey for him, et cetera, et cetera. So my question is related to this. We're fundamentally talking about man in terms of the gross physical body, but then there's the ego element where identity is, which is the locus for identity. And it seems, especially nowadays, we're getting a lot more information about it. You can have the gross body, but have the identity that's opposite the gross body. And so I'm asking a question about how this term man plays into the ego, because it's a little bit apart from the physical body in this particular sense. I don't know if that even made it clear.
It makes sense. It's just it's challenging.
It's a difficult question.
When I think about I can only speak from my own experience here. That say 5, certainly 15 years ago, I had a kind of archetypal idea of man, and I was trying to live into that. And now my own conception is much more fluid based on what I see the atmosphere around me requiring for a healthy interaction for all the people involved. So I think in this postmodern context, the proactive approach of seeing the situation and then offering into it what is going to support the best thing that could be going on, given the individuals present and their various conceptions, is the only safe way to be. Whereas if I'm like, I'm going to be a man, and I'm therefore like a square peg trying to force myself into a round hole somewhere, it creates a lot of awkwardness. And toxicity, maybe we could say, that insistence that I'm the man and therefore it has to be this way, regardless of circumstance, regardless of others' experience.
Well, that just sounds like you're a good person.
That's kind of you to say, but I guess that's what I'm saying, is to be a good person today is much more of a concern than being a good man or a good woman in a kind of archetypal sense. And I find that whether we can say objectively or philosophically if that's good or bad, I find on the ground, like rubber meeting the road, that's what I have to do to like go to sleep at night without feeling bad about myself.
Okay, nice. I have a follow-up for that, but yeah, Hari Vilas.
Well, I think there's definitely a distinction one can see between the. It is possible to have a subtle body that has more masculine or feminine traits, even if one is in a gross body of either one. It's definitely clear, and we see it even astrologically. You can see, for example, there are masculine planets, male planets, and then, for example, in a specific individual's chart, that the female, the feminine planets can, for example, all be concentrated in what can be considered the external aspects of the physical body and the external identity. And then the internal, the planets that are dominating the internal world can be heavily masculinely influenced. So even there, it's like you can, even astrologically, you can see this difference of gender playing out in these different roles. I think as we start discussing this, one thing to just keep in mind is that the reason why masculine and feminine gender has been, is now in one sense becoming more irrelevant to a certain extent, is because it's not so much connected anymore to raising children to a certain extent. Why is that? It is also just due to the influence of technology. Like in the past, if you wanted to have sex, you will have children. It's like, that's what happens. But now, by birth control, you don't have to have children anymore. And the same thing happens with, if you wanted to have, now you can either technologically, you can have children in all kinds of different ways. So the technology is a thing that is basically leveled out. It's made certain things irrelevant. So when we look at ancient society, which is where more, when we speak about traditional masculine archetypes, where does that come from? It comes from older societies, older social understandings of what it meant to be male. We inherited these things. We didn't just create them. We got them, sort of inherited them from whatever your background is. But these things were coming from a time in which the distinction between the genders were very strong, because also of biological reasons, not just cultural reasons. Like, for example, the fact that women can have career nowadays, it's not just because somehow they were allowed now to have a career. No, like, before there was birth control or the ability to deal scientifically and hygienically with the fact that you're going to menstruate, it was very difficult to have a career, because it means, imagine, like, now a woman can decide, okay, for the next 10 years, I'm not going to have children. So therefore, she can enter into a career knowing that in 10 years, she will be safe, or she decided she wants to have a career. So I'm saying technology is the thing that changed also a massive about and that we're now only dealing with it. So I think that, as David Marava said, in one sense, inevitably, I think even for us who are now, in one sense, we have a foot in the Vedic culture, which is very traditional. I mean, inherited certain traditional ideas, but at the same time, we're seeing that the reality is that the world, the gross world, has become transformed by the birth of technology, and it becomes clear that we have to be a bit more. We have to give space for the individual understanding of identity. Otherwise, it's just not, because we just have to adapt to the reality in which we're living. And it is now a time where the individual has much more scope to sort of accept, one could say, a customized kind of role and responsibility within society. And we have to then, I think it's important, but before going for the individual customized approach, one need at least to have an understanding of the principles. There's certain kind of principles, and I think that's when we can get to a beneficial discussion for people. Before you do your customization process, understand that there are still certain principles that are governing how a successful life is supposed to develop. And in that sense, we can strike a balance between being accommodating, but at the same time, not being, I could say, irresponsible in thinking that you can actually just do whatever the hell you want to, and that there will be no consequences, because that also doesn't actually work.
Nice. I would like to come back to that. Because you said that would be a beneficial discussion if we could identify What are the general principles that sort of form the boundaries? That would be super important to identify. But before we do that, I wanted to get in, just maybe as a transition point, we have, is it Jen Hammerberg? Jen Hammerberg. Sorry if I'm pronouncing that wrong, but there's a question here, or kind of a comment question. If I may add my opinion to the questions, personal identity and physical bodies are independent from each other. No. Right? So at that point we are also making. People make the mistake of identifying with concepts and ideas that are fluid. Our own consciousness changes every day, let alone from one body to another. Yeah, so I guess that kind of relates to what Hari Vilas. You guys want to comment on that?
I didn't say that. I definitely
no, you didn't say that. What I was going to say is that it relates to the idea. It relates to the idea of needing to have boundaries. Otherwise, it becomes like this.
Sure. Well, firstly, it's not independent. Yeah. It's not completely constrained. That's a fact. Like your physical body is not the ultimate thing that will basically determine your whole identity. That is clear. But it is not completely independent. Secondly, consciousness is fluid. That is a fact. Certain ideas are fluid. But at the same time, you will inhabit a masculine or a feminine body for your whole life. So in one sense, it's just like, yes, your consciousness is fluid. It is changing. But exactly that's what I mean. Certain things don't change until you die and take a new body. So that has to be taken into consideration, that yes, there is some fluidity, and personal identity shouldn't be the only thing that determines your identity. But it's still, we have to ask the question, how big is it? And that's a question of quantity. But that's an important question, because to think that we're completely independent, if you see, the problem is, if you think you're completely independent of something, but you aren't, then you're in trouble. Because then you're not going to accommodate for the reality that you are not it, you know. So that has to be understood.
Right. I feel like, and I could be mistaken because I haven't like studied this deeply, but within postmodern thinking and the tendency for emphasizing subjectivity, personal subjectivity, and deconstructing of reality, I think at the fundamental defect of that way of thinking is that it doesn't take into account the gross physical body. And the limitations that having a body actually puts on you. Like, it just kind of discounts that point, which is of like a huge factor. Yeah. The body is a huge, like, we don't normally tend to think of it because of our identity with it, but the body is actually an imposition. You know, I want to fly. I can't fly. I've been trying to gain weight for the last 5 to 10 years, you know, and I try to eat more, and I can't because there's an actual physical limitation to the body that I have right now.
Well, maybe a limitation for you. For some people, that would be a superpower.
So my point is that it's an imposition. Or if you want to, you know, I'm thinking about eating, sleeping, mating, and defending. You have to do those things. It's an imposition, and you can't say I will not do. So for the most part, that, you know, one of them, you can, you know, has a little bit of flexibility. Well, for the most part, this is an imposition. So I feel like the problem with a lot of postmodern thinking, and as children of the postmodern era, our thinking, is just what you just said, Harvey Last, that we don't appreciate the degree of imposition on our lives, and it's sort of a sort of inability to just reconcile ourselves to reality, like learning to accept, like, okay, this is the reality that I got, and then I have to deal with that particular thing. I think that's a general fault of
and also, like, as you pointed out, is the imposition, because see, ultimately it's a burden. It's like, whether you're masculine or feminine, it's a burden. It's like the burden of masculinity or the burden of femininity. It's like, it means responsibility and constraint, you know. And therefore people want to rebel against it, but whatever you want to be, it will constrain you. Any identity that you choose, it's a constraining identity. So we have to understand that there will be some bitter with the sweet, you know. It will be inevitable, and therefore one has to go into it with a little bit of a sober understanding that, you know, yes, I am constrained by certain things, so let me see what are my constraints, and then from there I figure out what is my freedoms. And yeah, like you were saying, it's imposition. It's not going to be all fun. It's not like, you know, whichever one you want to choose, whichever. And even if you have it would be interesting to speak with someone who is transgender, to have their experience of transgendering into another gender, and then seeing, again, experiencing that, wow, here again I'll be constrained. Like now I've lost certain, I have certain experiences one, now I'm another, and there will be the same thing, certain privileges, certain constraints. It's just inevitable that's how it works.
Yeah, very nice. I have another phase of the conversation, but I wanted to take out some of these other questions real quick. Maybe it looks like Ujwala has one. Maybe you can read it, Corona Avatar. I can't. What is the thing here?
Sure, yeah. Just a sec. Okay, I've got it. Okay, so Ujwal says, he was saying, I'm wondering if the ahankar is playing such a strong role in the identity per se. Is it such a strong influence here? Or is it just that the ahankar, now for those that don't know, ahankar means false ego, false identification with a particular identity, whatever that may be. Or is it just that the ahankar is a neutral kind of lens that fits or allows one to identify with the physical body? It seems to me that the behaviors and spelling error, and as such sexuality would be a little lower on the chain, i.e. intellectual activity carried out on the basis of vrittis in the mind and the karmic samskars that shape the intellect and mind. Maybe too technical, but I'm genuinely curious. Everyone is like,
I couldn't. I kind of lost the last part. The first part, I'm getting.
yeah.
What he's implying, which is that at the level of false egos is simpler even than the distinction of male and female. Like you don't have a male false ego or a female false ego at its most basic expression.
Right.
It's an extra layer somewhere down the chain of identification.
Right, which is kind of, I felt like that was the point we were kind of driving home. It has this ability to be broken down and reconstructed or expanded and contracted. I was using different language around that. And so it is the element that is responsible for identity in a particular way and is largely linked to the gross physical body. But in the human life form, it becomes a little bit playful. Because in the human life form, the mental capacities in the human species are vastly superior than other species. And so the psyche or antakarna, whatever word you want to use, the inner instrument composed of ego and intellect and mind gets a little complicated in the human life form. And thus, these sorts of conversations have to take place. I don't think any deer are going to be having any conversations about, what does it mean to be a deer? It doesn't happen. They don't have the complexities of a human psyche. And the human psyche, it gets a little bit more complicated. But yeah, I also, that point I'm getting, the ego is just like an element. It's kind of neutral, responsible for identity. And then the karma and some scars kind of do the rest of the work there.
It's like the more gross the consciousness becomes, the more constraining the gender is. For example, a male deer and a female deer, they're going to be greatly determined according to their actual physical gross form, will determine a lot of their identity. But the more elevated you become, or even the more intellectual you become, you see, then the constraints of the physical form become less apparent. And we see that even in general, also you see the discussion, even something like transgenderism, to a certain extent, it only becomes so apparent in a highly educated society in which there is a lot of time and freedom and sort of mental space to sort of start to dealing with these things. But in a heavily impoverished society where people are just really working and it's like there's not so much freedom even intellectually and mentally to explore these ideas, to work with it. So it is clear that the more gross you become, the more constraining gender is, and the more educated at least it becomes more, it takes hold of one so much. And even in our society, we see that we have a whole culture of people who are celibate renunciates, people who are not even dealing with mundane gender, they're not even constrained, they're not even working on the platform of mundane, masculine and feminine, because they're just completely clocked out of that whole game. And what are they? Are they male or female? To a certain extent, they're not. They're just like, they're beyond it. They're not really moved by those things. So there is definitely gender can definitely be transcended, and it is a fact. But it is not. Yeah, it's not so easy. That's just the one thing that I've understood. It's not so easy just to transcend gender, or to think one cannot just. It's not such a simple thing, because for most of us, the gross form will, especially, you will see what happens, especially in times of stress, then the influence of the gross physical form becomes more apparent, because then you go back to a more primal situation, and then you just more are going to act like an animal. And it is definitely towards on that animal level where the female and the male distinction will become more clearer. So in times of stress it happens, but when everything is happy and peaceful, then sort of you can play around a little bit more.
I love the point. And I think it's a sad irony of the way our community, as the devotional society Krishna Bhaktas, approaches these questions. We kind of dismiss the element of truth that's there in this gender fluidity conversation, and same with homosexuality and all the other kind of things that we reject on religious propriety. There's an underlying element of truth, the relative experience of the material energy, and it doesn't have any absolute value, and therefore to dismiss it is in one sense healthy. But the challenge is that most people are relativizing so that they can enjoy their senses more freely, right? It opens more opportunities on the buffet of sense gratification. Therefore, let me tear down those structures which seem in the way of me feeling good when I want to feel good. And in our context, what is valuable about those limits is, to your point, with less stuff to focus on, you get to pay attention to what really matters, which we say is our relationship with divinity, Krishna, learning to become a servant of that reality.
Beautiful. This is actually a great transition point, I think, for what I'm coming up with now. Is I think there's this thing called the paradox of choice. And I'm probably going to butcher this thing, but basically when you have too many choices, you actually become paralyzed. Paralyzed is a better word. And my personal experience of this is, as a kid, I love cereal. I'm a classic American guy. I like cereal. And being taken to the grocery store and going in the cereal aisle was so paralyzing because there were so many choices, and my mom only allowed me to get one box. So it was like I was always like, wrestling between Golden Grams and Cinnamon Toast Crunch and Lucky Charms. Like, which one did I want? And having so many choices, you actually become paralyzed. So in a very sort of similar way, I don't know if this is the perfect correlation, but in a very similar way, with the total freedom to sort of formulate your identity according to how you see fit, then it appears to me, at least, and I could be wrong, it appears to me that the generation of children that are part of the postmodern era, ourselves, we are utterly bewildered. We are utterly, and I had this realization about a year and a half ago when I was walking in the streets of New York, and I was probably fault finding, to be real, because I needed a little bit of boost for my own ego. So I just started fault finding. And I remember walking in the city, and I was kind of comparing the New York environment to like the old religious world that I hear about in the scripture. And I was thinking, in exchange for the freedom that we have now, we get to be bewildered, because you get to be 30, 40, 50 years old, and you still don't have a clear sense of who you are, whilst proclaiming that you're looking for yourself this whole time. It's taking you 50 years and you still don't have a clear sense. And whereas in the old world, you had a lot less social freedoms, but you had a utter clarity about like kind of who you were in a conventional sense and what you were supposed to do. And that was very useful, especially if you were trying to become spiritual at some point in your life, because that part was taken care of. And now I can put my energy into the spiritual development. And it seems to me, as practitioners of yoga, bhakti, Vedanta, whatever you want to call it, because that part isn't figured out, like the ego part, the conventional ego part isn't figured out in a healthy way, we start trying to like build our egos within our spiritual communities. So we want to be the next guru, the next sannyasi. Like I wanted to be a guru sannyasi because like everyone bows down and you get to speak, everyone listens to you, and you get to play the Mahaprasadam first.
And you can choose what you eat.
So because I didn't have a healthy sense of my own identity, because I had the utter freedom to build my identity however I want, I was like actually paralyzed in my conventional life. And then I tried to build it with the building blocks of this the thing in the spiritual community, which was not supposed to be for that whatsoever. It's supposed to be about going beyond all these things. And so I guess my question is around this paradox of choice. Like Harvey Lash, you spoke about like having healthy boundaries, like understanding like, okay, the body is a constraint. There's a certain ego that's connected to that body. That's also a constraint. And I kind of have to understand the boundaries of that constraint so that I can work within it in a healthy way. And if so desired at a later point, transcend it. So how do we define those healthy constraints of being a man? Because frankly speaking, like David Madhava mentioned earlier, I'm pretty sure if I asked any guy in our community, devotional community or otherwise, what it means to be a man, they would be paralyzed in their ability to articulate it because of being products of the postmodern era. Also, like, well, I don't know, it's about that, and we'll say some speculation. So, what are the healthy parameters? Like, what are the constraints we need to understand, in your view, and so that we can have a healthy embodied existence? Like, I'm in the body and I have a very unhealthy embodied existence. So what is it? What are those constraints I need to understand so I can work within the body in a healthy way and move beyond it if I so desire at a later point? That's my question. Is it okay?
Yeah, just one thing on the paradox of choice. Also, interestingly enough, it leads to bewilderment, and also just as it's formulated, the paradox of choice. It means that as societies have more choice, the one thing that exponentially increases is also regret. No, it's a fact, because once you make a decision, you suffer much more regret because you have all these other alternatives and you're thinking, God, did I miss out? And it's fascinating because you can imagine even with, even people that do actually go to the point of having like a sex change operation, the statistics also quite for regret, because imagine that's also imagine it's the kind of regret that you get when you buy the wrong shoes and you're like, wow, I should have chosen a different pair. Imagine like changing something as substantial as your gender. It means regret. The more you have options, the more there is regret. If you have no options, then there's nothing to regret. And what's fascinating is that some of the most powerful people in the world, like Steve Jobs, you would see he always wore exactly the same clothes. He always wore blue jeans and a white shirt and black shoes, because he didn't want to waste time and what he should think about wearing. So it's interesting, like the more you limit your choices, you actually free up your consciousness, because you don't have to worry about bewilderment, you don't have to worry about regret. And that was interesting as Prabhupada. Also at a certain point, there was someone who came to the temple, and once he came as a man, and another time he came as a woman. And then Prabhupada said, well, you should just choose. Prabhupada said, like, you should just make a choice so that you can like choose what you want to be and then go, and then you can actually start the business of living. Because that's a problem. It's like, you know, like once you know what your identity, people say, okay, the search, the pleasure is in the search. It's not. The pleasure is not in the search. It's like, it's when you experience what you are, then you fulfill the responsibilities, and then you can live. You know, so same thing with marriage. You see, marriage is also a traditional value, which means you choose one person, and then okay, done. And then you can just stop thinking about other people now. Stop considering all these options. Now this is the person. Just make peace with it, and now actually get on with the business of life. Whereas if you every year you marry someone else, then your life never actually starts. So it's very fascinating that dynamic of just choosing and making the best of the situation.
Nice observation. Good point.
Yeah, well, I love that, and I would like to offer that as a consideration of one of those hallmarks of the masculine is the willingness and capacity to choose, to actually make a decision. And I've spoken to many women.
Laughing, but yeah,
I've spoken to many women about this, and they actually they avoid situations where it's just women who are going to be there in a kind of situation where they need to do something, because they're worried that there's not going to be a point where they actually decide and move forward. There's going to be a lot of talking and a lot of testing the feelings and looking at angles and exploring, which is all has its place. But then if there's not the time where you say, okay, now something needs to be done, then we're missing out on the whole point. And so whether that comes from a woman, you know, physiologically a woman or physiologically a man, that presence of an executive, a decision maker, is essential in any functioning social organism. Family unit, government, business, etc. You need an executive, somebody who's going to take the decision.
Yes. Wow.
And
Well,
it's not fun. That's everything. It's a burden. There's a reason people don't want to be the guy to make the decision. People think I want power, but it's not fun because you're the guy who's going to take the hit. And that's why people are like, I don't know, you do, I don't care. Like someone else can choose because I don't want to take the hit.
Oh, they'll care when it's time to give the hit. That's when they care. When it's time to point the finger.
I'm laughing so hard because I don't even know if I should be bringing this up. It's probably not perfectly appropriate, but I'll just say I've been in organizations in our devotional communities, and I've been in meetings like, the top meetings where they're having to make some strong decision. And I've just observed so many times no one wanting to make this decision. And I'm just having just a good laugh. Like, yeah, that's a very kind of like a male quality. Like, I'm going to make this, I'm going to put my foot down and this is what we're going to do, whether you like it or not. And it's not fun because then you have to take all the energy. But I still, back to my question, how do we understand a healthy embodied masculinity in a postmodern era, which is kind of the question of the title of the show? Like, how are we supposed to find that or discover that, which seems a little bit difficult from all that we've brought up now?
Yeah, I just quickly want to say that I'm having such a great time being part of the audience here, and I just want to say that the audience is really appreciating. Ujval says, fantastic point. Nahusha is so true. Ujval says, wow, damn good stuff. Sadhu. Harley says, the nectar be flowing, Prabhus. Kishore Gopal says, facts. So everyone's really into it. So we're doing good, guys. But I also want to say that well, it is the Honest Man's podcast after all. But yeah, another reason for my silence is that I'm doing some super uncomfortable introspection right now, and I'm sort of like formulating and building up my personal testimony. So that will come. But yeah, let's get back to that. Let's get back to that most essential question, Jai Jagannath. If you could perhaps just very succinctly remind us of that, so that everyone's with us.
Where am I supposed to look to find the principles of embodying a healthy masculinity? Because especially, I know this is not succinct because I keep my ranting. I'm on rant mode right now. But part of being a part of the postmodern era, especially between 2010 and 2020, men have taken a lot of hit in general in terms of their social identity. It's not a very overall positive outlook. I don't know if you saw the other day, one of our friends, he also does a podcast. I don't know if I'm dropping names, but he shared a post where Prabhupada, the founder Acharya of ISKCON, he's telling that the woman should serve her man, even if he's like grumpy old Mooney, in the context of where it was coming. And he read that verse to his wife, and his wife thought it was funny. And she joked also. She said, I totally agree with this poor part. I do have a grumpy old. Yeah. So it was like kind of playful. He shared it on his Facebook page, and within less than an hour, he had 135 comments on his page, and you can go and see it. And I think it's gone up to at least 200 comments, upward of 200 comments. What I found interesting about a lot of the comments there, particularly from women, but also from men in the comments thread, was that the general image of men was that irresponsible. That was kind of the sense that I got from a lot of the thread, and that it kind of, the idea of like surrendering to your man or serving your man, for example, in a marriage relationship, was taken as a negative because it presupposed that the man was not going to be responsible, or that he would ultimately not be able to fulfill that function. And therefore, that wasn't a good model for trying to establish a relationship. So I'm again brought back to this sort of demoralized feeling about being a man. I don't feel good to be a man. I grew up largely worshiping heroine archetypes. Like if it was X-Men, I was into Storm or Phoenix Jean Grey. If it was, I like some other shit that I'm not going to even say because I'm a little too embarrassed to say because it doesn't seem very manly. But in any case, my point is that the image of man particularly I'm saying 2010, 2020, but in the postmodern era, is rather demoralized. So I'm a man, I have a man's body, I have a man's ego largely, but I don't have a healthy sense of what it means to be a man. So where am I supposed to look to discover the principles of embodying a healthy male masculinity? I'm not going to look into postmodern culture because I think it's demonic in principle. And I don't think they have that much to offer of value. So I'm supposed to go to the scriptures, but then I don't always get necessarily a clarity. So that's my question to you all. Where do I look to discover these sort of boundary lines and which I can work within and help me to transcend in a healthy way and so on?
I personally have been so enlivened recently by my reading of the Mahabharata.
Oh, yes.
And I have been feeling so embarrassed to read about these men and see how they behave. Because yes, they kick ass on the battlefield and millions of people die at their hands. All that, fine. Right? But they also are sitting there with Draupadi, showering her with sweet words and begging her forgiveness for even the slightest discomfort that comes to her. Draupadi is the wife of the heroines in this epic, the Mahabharata. They are ever diligent to make sure that their wife and anybody else in their field of concern, the Brahmanas, et cetera, are feeling safe, protected for, and supported in who they want to be, supported in what they want to do. And if they're not able to do that, they feel deeply embarrassed, shamed, and like something's got to be different about what I'm doing because they're not feeling, my protection. So the Mahabharata is one place where there's just such a living, fresh sense of possibility for men being vindicated as a useful thing in society. And to your point, Jai, I just want to, it's almost affirmation by negation that everybody ultimately points all the society's problems back to the behavior of men. It's almost an affirmation. I won't
Absolutely.
say an affirmation that it is men's fault, but it is also men's opportunity to take care of business in the real sense. As Hari Vilas Prabhu put it, power today is seen as an opportunity to enjoy. If I have power, it means I get to exploit a situation, exploit a people, and enjoy the resources thereof. But real power means responsibility. Who do I have to take care of? And in what ways do I need to take care of them? If all of the men, women, and whomever else that are really concerned with the world begin to conceive in this way, not what are my rights and privileges, but how do I offer respect and what are my responsibilities within that context? That's when we'll see transformation. And that's the healthy element of masculinity.
So you dropped a lot of jewels here. I want to amplify this affirmation by negation. I'm going to say it in a way that's more agitating, obviously, because it's just my personality. But I did shoot a video about half a year ago, maybe almost a year ago, where I made the point that actually, if we want the society can only get better if men are improved. And it's kind of like an affirmation by negation. If it's men's fault that the world is in the situation that it is, which I think can be largely and easily demonstrated, that means it is only man that can fix it, no? In other words, you have to have the solution to the problem short of just wiping out all men. That's the other option, is to actually create the ideal man, whatever that means. But you have to create that sort of person if you were going to actually do good to society. And I tend to think that largely almost all societal ills can be linked back to the demoralization of man as a proper contributor and his kind of like proper place of dignity within the society. So I just wanted to amplify that point. And I think it's probably another podcast because someone might object to that, but just affirmation by negation, and then having proper stories where you have better male archetypes, like not Homer Simpson is not your archetype, or I like fantasy genre of movies, growing up and so on. And like one of the popular ones is like vampires. And I thought about this later as a devotee, that like I'm really rooting for the bad guy in this movie or in this series. He's a guy who literally exists by exploiting and feeding off the blood of others. And I'm rooting for that fellow. And he suffers from a perpetual childhood, literally, because he's, they often become immortals when they're like teenagers. And so he's actually suffering from a perpetual child. And that's like the guy that I'm looking to for inspiration and encouragement and jokes. So I don't have healthy archetypes in order to, embody a healthy male identity. So proper stories like Mahabharata. You got anything else for us, Hari Vilas? Same question.
Well, I was thinking that really there's only one person, the most important person in understanding if you are being a proper male or not is your wife. If she is happy to a certain extent, then, then what really does matter? And therefore we see that I think also, in that one, because that's where the male identity really becomes one that's important, because it's in relationships where a lot of this stuff gets cracked out. And like, for example, if you're a monk, there's no really need to get into the question of what does it mean to be a male to a large part, because you have your monastic identity that is supposed to be guiding your ideals. And then if you're properly fulfilling those ideals, then you will be happy. So the male question of masculine identity really comes out when you get married, because then if you're not going to be a proper, whatever you want to call it, but that's when it's going to come out. It's that this other person will be unhappy and dissatisfied and the thing won't work. And therefore we see that to a large part then, therefore, it also does to a certain extent then become individualized, because two people have to come together and you have to make an agreement of what does it mean, what is our mutual responsibilities and towards one another. And that is where the details of the masculine identity to a large part get worked out. And therefore it will also differ to the specifics of it will differ, although there will be some generalities toward it. But it's true, masculine archetypes, it's very important, like Bharata Muni, who wrote the Natya Shastra, he said, for example, that it is sinful to write drama in which an irreligious person is seen to attain success. Because he says that, because it doesn't actually work like that. If you're really a vampire, imagine if you really lived off the blood of others. Imagine how Tomasic you will be. Very difficult to get up in the morning. You'll be very aggressive. Your digestion will be shot. You will have acne. Your breath will stink. It won't be at all attractive. You probably won't be a teenager. It's that, so it creates a complete false sense of what these things mean. So it's very dangerous. So therefore, better to look. And also, I think people also have to understand, to a large part, specifically the masculine identity, it's not as romantic as you think it is. It's like, basically it means, if you think about, for a large part, what it means you have to get a job and you have to support a family. And it just means working for 6-7 hours and being very regulated with your duty and taking the hit and just sacrificing your own happiness to a large part to support others. That's what it really means. It's not like you have to be a superhero or be able to fly. It's actually something very basic and very, very painful. But to a certain extent, the benefit that you get is also there. And therefore, it's nice to look at more the traditional archetypes like Mahabharata, whatever, is very nice. So religious people that are then at the same time fulfilling their duties and seeing that it's definitely. I think, because generally when we start asking some of these questions, I always try to think, well, what does Krishna say in Bhagavad Gita? Because Bhagavad Gita is supposed to be the thing that sort of boils everything down in a simple platform. Like, for example, astrology, I was trying to think, how important should I make astrology in my life? And I think, well, Krishna didn't really speak about astrology. He didn't say something about Saturn or Mars. So it means it can't be that important. It's just a supportive thing. So if you think about Bhagavad Gita, I think more important to understand that if you want to invest in the elevation of whether your masculine identity, feminine identity, monastic identity, whatever the thing is that you're trying to figure out, the more important characteristic is to understand that the three modes of nature, it will give you a determining factor about the levels of masculinity, the levels of femininity. A male in the mode of ignorance will have certain characteristics, a mode of passion, certain characteristics, in the mode of goodness. So I think once you bring in the modes of nature as a sort of an added category to look at that through the lens of these different things, then it becomes clear. Then you see, it means the more I try to approach the dictates or the requirements of the mode of goodness, then my masculinity or my femininity, whatever, it will sort it out itself in a more natural kind of way. And if you're going to be in the mode of passion or ignorance, then it doesn't really matter, because then we know there will either be suffering or ignorance, or whatever your flavor of gender identity is.
Excellent. I heard aside from the healthy stories and archetypes within those stories, I also heard the gunas as a really strong thing to look at for understanding and categorizing healthy masculinity and also your relationship, specifically with your wife, which is where this is going to really start to come out, is another. But your relationships in general, not only to your wife but to your society, to help get a sense of a healthy embodied masculinity. All right, Karuna Avatar, we're gonna go for our final, maybe our final words or statements. This has been actually a super excellent conversation. I'm getting a lot out of it. Not only am I having a good time, but I'm getting a lot out of this conversation. I'm probably gonna rehear it and take some notes. But you've been boiling up. Something's been boiling up inside Karuna Avatar. A revelation of sorts. Perhaps you want to share this now.
My God, gentlemen, yeah, I've just been, yeah, I've been in awe all this time. All right, no, but what I'll say is that for most of my life, my relationships with, in my relationships with the opposite sex, with women, I have generally felt quite manly. You know, I have generally felt that I'm naturally quite adept at encouraging, at offering guidance, at offering affection, at offering protection and a sense of certainty. And just, you know, for all of you that don't know, I'm not married. I haven't taken that final step. So of course, all these relationships that I'm speaking about are merely friendships and familial relationships and past romantic relationships. So I have generally felt that, you know, manliness as kind of stereotypically underpinned by natural sense of leadership has been there for me. But recently I've had a very interesting experience that actually just last night I was reflecting on quite extensively, and I was having a conversation with someone about it. Is that I recently made a female friend who is just an incredibly powerful person. She's really just like a powerhouse on all levels. She's incredibly grounded. She's like super intelligent and analytical and rational. She's naturally very sort of like detached from the tidings of, you know, of the material world, the dualities of the material world. And there's just kind of like this fixedness that I've never actually come across in any other woman before. And I must be honest that in relationship to this particular person, I feel like a lady. I seriously feel like, you know, if hypothetically this person were to be my partner, then I would be like the happiest housewife ever. I would like totally be, I would be in my element as a lady of leisure. I'm telling you guys, I'm just going to cook and I'm going to create like a beautiful home environment, and I'm just going to do that thing and just feel like so in my element doing that, relative to this person whose you know, whose qualities, whose masculine qualities as manifest in her perhaps ego identity and subtle body are just so so powerful. So it has certainly, you know, endowed me with a certain realization as to the fluidity of like let's say fluidity of like the extent of identification with a particular sort of objective standards of what manhood or masculinity actually is. And then just kind of like coming a little bit further into what we've just, you know, been discussing most recently, is that, you know, Hari Vilas, like you were saying that you know, that being a man actually just really means like buckling down taking that basic responsibility, voluntarily accepting a particular burden that you're willing to stick with, right? That is what manhood is. And just last night, I was in this particular conversation that I was having, I was expressing with great feeling my super intense aversion at doing that, at being for decades of my life being bogged down and literally chained to some, to some sort of situation like that. Because also, but now bringing it into this very, very universal affliction that I think almost all of us experience, is that we just don't have good examples to look up to. We just don't have that. Like people that I know, my even like my own father, like in most ways, I would way rather be the opposite, that is my experience. And looking at my uncles within my family, they who are incredibly pious, responsible, determined, like very typical men, you could say, in a stereotyped sense, but just so much anxiety and so much like just and I think that's also what happens in the secular context of like accepting those typical male responsibilities in a secular context. Then it becomes especially burdensome because enjoyment is minimized. Enjoyment is actually just completely thrown by the wayside. Your sense gratification is really like it becomes the lowest priority, and that becomes a very, very distasteful situation. So what we really need to come to, or I feel where I really need to come to in order to ultimately fulfill my potential as a man, is to have really good examples to look up to. Because Deva Madhava Prabhu, I have read Mahabharata twice, and recently the second time round, and just like you, I've been so inspired by these great men, but at the same time just intimidated as hell, just being like, oh my god, like I could never embody this, my just I'm just like some trashy product of the postmodern era, and just how could I possibly ever like live on that level of piety and male strength. So we need real examples. And I'm going to be honest, and I'm going to get all fuzzy like I usually do. Like Deva Madhava, Harivilas, you guys happen to be some of my greatest heroes. That's why ultimately I wanted to bring you onto this podcast, because you can give us some sort of idea, because I genuinely look up to both of you as really, really great men that I look to. And I think that also, like, we're all friends, and in the context of the sanghas, that the various sanghas that we've been having online over these lockdown months, this point has arisen so strongly that we need communities of brotherhood in which we're able to really come together, and in which we're able to really help each other figure it out, because it's hard, like looking at the older generation, especially in our movement. There are many great examples of great men, but still, like, in the context of having to figure out, coming out of the secular world and having a spiritual society in the context of the modern secular world, and then having to reconcile certain Vedic values and realities with just like the cesspool and slaughterhouse of the mind and soul that is this society that we find ourselves in. Our older generation has had to figure out so much along the way, and they haven't actually, many of them, I think, as a generation, haven't exactly sociologically had the opportunity to settle into what it means to be a real man in the context of our spiritual society in this world, to really like show us how it's done. You know, so much we've had to navigate through so many misconceptions and fanaticism, but then on the other hand also just being overly liberal. Anyway, so the point is just it's just damn hard. You know, where do we look ultimately? I certainly I feel completely intimidated, because, you know, I am an idealist, and I do understand, like, let's say, orthodox masculinity quite well, and I really would like to live up to that, but God, what a thing.
You really unleashed on us there. It was like building up. But the essence of what I got from that is, you know, aside from your interesting story in the beginning, I feel more like a lady when I'm in relationship to this other lady who tends to embody what may seem to be like typical male qualities. One thing I kind of thought of when you were making that part of your story is something that Harvey Vilas alluded to also, particularly, I find it to be particularly true in a postmodern era, trying to establish relationships, is to like have a conversation with your would-be partner, because the social contracts are going to be a lot different than the sort of social expectations that we hear about in the older world on the scriptures and so on. And also, I kind of got a strong element is that aside from having like the ideal archetypes, because one thing I've noticed about ideals is that they can be like beacons giving guidance, but they can also really crush you inside and demoralize you. Especially like the ideal of Krishna Prema. It's like, and you like, I kind of like, you know, our first episode was like, I kind of like porn. Like, I don't know if that's and so the contrast of such a high ideal with such low conditionings from our social world can be very demoralizing. And I got a sense of that also hearing you, Karuna, which I like, it's like, wow, these guys from the Mahabharata, wow, wonderful. I'll never be able to do that. And unless I see like a living example in my community of someone who's like navigating this with skill and grace, it becomes extremely difficult to embody a healthy masculinity. And I definitely can relate to that a lot. Didn't grow up with my own father, and I didn't really grow up with a lot of men. I did in the kind of very younger years of my life. My mom would send me to my uncles and so on, but they weren't like ideal dudes. They were like ghetto, you know. And they were ghetto enough for me to know as a young kid, you're not a good example.
That's the next term we're gonna seek to define on this podcast.
Like, oh, you ghetto on me. I ain't following that. And so again, you just feel like, I guess I wouldn't have the language at the time, but you feel really alienated from your own body, basically. And just because you just don't really know what that means, it's all negative. So I got a lot of sense of that. So just adding to what we've already said, just the need for like living examples to help one really come to terms with embracing a healthier sense of what it means to be a man in the postmodern era, where technology has really jacked up, in a sense, at least the way that I see it and hear it, jacked up social contracts and ways of dealing. I don't know if you guys heard anything else, maybe some final comments or thoughts here in this regard. Oh, we can't hear you.
Ooh.
You're muted.
Yeah, thank you. Oh, still can't hear you. Do 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 do.
Bhishma Dev Prabhu.
I'm trying to figure it out.
I can jump in the meantime.
Yeah.
What I just couldn't help but thinking about was this plight that women are in, actually. And I'm very happy to say that we're gonna, as a Boudica effort, we're gonna have our women's podcast up this Sunday. Will be the debut. And when we look at to try to protect a woman in today's day and age, which is the kind of, I love the point that without having that relationship of femininity in your life, then masculinity also doesn't have much meaning or value. And so when the ladies themselves are so harassed and exploited, then their capacity to trust and allow that masculinity to develop in a healthy way for their partner, it's not there. Their bandwidth to be patient with you and to even, help you see what they need from you, it has been stolen away by their own bad choices and by the abuse of society, both playing. And it creates such a short fuse in the situation, and stuff falls apart very quickly. So that's one thing I wanted to say. And the second thing, I think somebody's echoing bouncy. Is that me? Anyway, is I just recently realized that this whole problem of toxic masculinity that we've had in our own devotional society, it's kind of unfairly been put on our philosophy, that somehow in the philosophy, this is how you're supposed to treat women. This is how you're supposed to treat the world around you in general. And this like hating Maya means I love Krishna more kind of way. And you mentioned a sitcom, The Simpsons. If you look at the 80s and 90s sitcoms, the TV shows that were popular in America, especially, the whole premise was that the husband and a wife are a burden to each other. Everyone loves Raymond as a classic example, right? Husband, very stupid. Wife, very annoying. And then 22 minutes of laughter and hilarity ensues. And so this wife bad, husband bad culture is actually not something coming from the Bhagavatam or the Bhagavad Gita or the Krishna conscious society. It's a paradigm that has developed over the last 50 years after World War II, when everybody was given everything in their lap, literally, all the sense gratification they could want, and still they weren't happy. So then they had to turn back on each other and blame husband and wife as their two prime, the prime relationship in their life. It's your fault that I'm miserable, because as Hari Vilas Prabhu nicely pointed out, there is no higher value. There's no relationship with God anymore. There's no relationship with Krishna. And so it's your fault that I'm miserable. And so this wife bad, husband bad paradigm is not something unique to our devotee community. It's something that pervades basically the entire Western society. Now you see Zennials, millennials, that generation, the pendulum is swinging the other side. And now we're coming back to this idea, still mundane, that I have my my life partner, we're soulmates, I'm going to cherish you, I'm going to nurture you, I'm going to take care of your every whim and want, and that is my life, is to dedicate myself to your emotions. And so that is also unhealthy for so many reasons and is creating its own problems.
Nice.
Yeah.
Hari, some final words here. Can we hear you? No. Still not able to hear anything.
Okay, I'll just take. Oh, is Hari with us? Did we hear him? Did we just hear him?
His audio is just not working.
No. Oh man. Okay, Hari, maybe if you plug your headphones out and just we can just see a close up of your face. If you maybe just use your phone's mic, maybe that will work. Nah, still can't. Okay, anyway, I'll just read some comments. Hari's dad actually says, as part of the older generation, I wonder if I would have been a different type of man if I had the opportunity to discuss or talk about this in my younger years.
Wow.
Yeah.
I'm taking that as a compliment, so thank you.
Yeah, that's really nice. He's one of our biggest fans. I know him personally, and he's just like the most lovable, big bear of a caring dad that you could possibly imagine. Just look at his wonderful.
He must be. Hari, look at Hari Vilas. Amazing.
Yeah, Hari is testimony of his dad's great fatherhood. Absolutely. And then Harley makes an interesting comment saying, when I took saffron cloth,
that means
sorry, I just have a yeah. When I took saffron cloth, Devamrita Maharaj told me that proper male training is the means of saving the male gender and society at large. Because those who act Because those who act properly as men set an example for everyone else. It shows it can be done. Just a confirmation on that good point of living examples. And Ujval says he's too, referring to Harvey Lass, he's too awesome. Destroyed the mic with truth.
Yeah.
Jai.
I don't really have any finals. Wait, Ari?
No, it's still out. Sorry.
Oh, we
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, awesome. Okay, so just my final comments. One thing I think is very important to say, or two things. The first is that there are actually many wonderful examples of people, but they're just not as showy as one would expect of modern archetypes. I know many devotees who are solid. They're solid guys. They're like really doing the thing. They're taking care of their family nicely. They're performing devotional service nicely. But you have to look for them because you can miss them because they just look like ordinary guys just doing their thing. But that's exactly what it is. It's just the ordinary guy doing the real thing. And the problem is that younger guys, they don't take shelter of them. We take shelter of guys, I mean, all due respect, who have, I mean, okay, maybe I shouldn't go there. But even in our modern ISKCON culture, we also have a tendency of celebrity worship, where we worship devotees for apparent wonderful singing voices, whatever it is. I'm not saying these guys are not nice, but I'm saying that we miss out on a lot of good sangha because there's guys that just look ordinary. But if you have a guy who's been married for 30 years and he's still chanting 16 rounds and he's still following his regulative principles, the guy's a hero. You know? And you have to actually see that and ask that guy, what are you doing? What should I do? And then you will see they will give you so many interesting tips for how to do it. So, but if you're just going to worship celebrities or just have a superficial understanding of who you are trying to follow, then well, good luck. The second point that I wanted to make is that whenever we discuss these supportive issues, masculinity, varnashram, whatever it is, anything that has to do with a temporary identity, the one thing you have to understand is that these identities are supportive. And they're standing on the basis of your understanding that you're a servant of Krishna and you're taking shelter of that identity as your primary identity. That informs and strengthens your ability to perform your secondary duties. And when you fail in the execution of your secondary duties, which is inevitable, then you have to take shelter of your primary duty, because that's the one thing you can always take shelter of. So to understand that your primary duty, your ability to execute your vows to your spiritual teacher and to perform your devotional service, they give you a certain kind of strength that allows you then to perform the duties of your external and supportive identities. And so then it eases the pressure off, because it's inevitable that you will fold. You're going to fold as a man. Who doesn't? Everybody folds, whatever it is that you're doing. And when you fold, it's then that you take shelter again of the understanding that, now I have to chant Krishna's holy name and ask him to help me. Because as I said, at the end, it's all a burden. It's all these things are any material identity, it's a burden. But you have to carry that burden because you have to carry some. If you're not going to carry it, then you're really going to get crushed. So try to carry it by taking shelter of that ultimate identity. And then one day, if you're lucky, then you can actually become relieved from all these secondary identities and their requirements of you. But the easiest way to get relieved from an identity is to fulfill the obligations of that identity. That's the actual reality. And that way it's a mix between not taking up too much pressure of the ideal and understanding that at the same time, even if you completely fail as a man or a woman, whatever it is, you can still take shelter of Krishna. That primary identity takes precedence. And that is Krishna is much more merciful than a wife or a husband. He's actually much more easy pleased. For us.
Jai.
Oh my God, Ari Vilas, so brilliant, so inspiring.
Wow.
I have nothing really to add to this.
I just want to say that we have some really good. People are really appreciating. Ujval says we all want to be a superstar. That is certainly true to some extent or the other. Kishore Gopal says, awesome point, Hari Vilas Prabhu. I've also realized this as well on the celebrity worship and missing out on the many unsung heroes. Lorian says, mind blown. Hey?
Kishore is on his way to becoming a celebrity, so hopefully he can do both for us.
Lorian
wanted
says mind blown, and Harley says so much intelligence. So yeah, I'm so grateful, Harry and Deva. Thank you so much for coming and joining us. It was such a stellar conversation, and certainly one that I think, this is the wonderful thing. We're having these conversations, and we have people that are with us right now, but this will be recorded in cyberspace, for a very long time to come, and many people can still get the benefit. So we're gradually building up just a storehouse of wisdom and discernment, which is for the benefit of society at large. Jai.
I have to close out with the shout outs and all that, but I did want to say that I wanted to amplify this last idea that Harry Vilas is making. Is a point that he and I have talked about quite a bit, about identity as a vehicle instead of identity as like who you actually are. Mm-hmm. And so in the Vedic concept, especially the ones we encounter in Vedanta, identity is a vehicle for a higher purpose. And I think largely the modern, postmodern era world suffers because of their lack of sense of an objective, absolute good or world out there to be achieved. Then they have to suffer with the notion that they are the vehicle. And that's when things get really terrible at the end of the day. They become horrible and burdensome. But you're relieved of that once you have an actual higher purpose to anchor the way that you relate to your sense of identity. And then with that anchor of your actual purpose, you can really start to get an intuitive sense of how you need to adjust within that ego so it doesn't distract you from your actual purpose. Mm-hmm. And so the two work kind of harmoniously in that way. And I wanted to say that because it gets asked about this podcast and about our group. By the way, this is part of an initiative, Sat Sangha, Sexual Sobriety and Transmutation Sangha, that Karuna Avatar and we kind of head up for helping guys come together and kind of embody a more healthy masculinity. And in our groups, we get this question, like, how is this really spiritual? Because it seems like a lot of discussion around the ego and around like conventional identity, around things that aren't directly spiritual or Krishna conscious, and And so the purpose of this is because, and I like to say this a lot, you'll probably hear me say this a lot on this particular podcast, a lot of us are more human than we are practitioner. And because of not having all the guidance we should have been having to learn how to deal with our conventional identity in a healthy way, where a lot of guys and gals, I suspect, also struggle quite a bit. So we just kind of wanted to open up the conversation to that. Not to de-emphasize the need for pursuing our higher purpose, but to learn how to deal with our conventional situation in a healthy way so we can pursue our higher purpose with skill, with grace, with confidence, with courage, free from doubt. Because I feel like a lot of us suffer from profound doubt because our conventional world is arresting our ability to feel confident about the pursuit of real purpose because we haven't really worked that shit out. So that's the purpose of these sorts of conversations. I'm really happy to see the engagement with it and the participation. It's really encouraging. We want to give a special thanks to Bhishma Dev. He's in the background helping and put everything up. We wouldn't be able to do this without him.
Unsung hero.
Another unsung hero. He's done all the advertisement we do, the little logos. This is all his work. So we want a special thanks to Bhishma. For those of you who are interested to, again, hear these things or maybe share them with some friends, we're there on Apple Podcasts and Spotify and other major podcasting platforms, so you can send it to them if you like. And special thanks to Hari Vilas and Dave Madhava Prabhu. You guys were super awesome today. It was a fantastic discussion. And look more to having these such discussions in the future. Thank you so much for being here. And always special thanks to you also, Karuna Avatar, for your enthusiasm, heartfelt. What's the word I'm looking for?
Effusions.
Heartfelt effusions. I wanted to add the phrase ladylike infusions, but that might have been toxic. So.
Well, just for the record, you would have been welcome, Jai.
All right, fam. Hari Om Tat Sat.
Gauranga.